General Andrea Walker sat alone in the quiet corner of the airport lounge. Her posture straight, her face calm, but her mind running like a machine. Even in this moment of solitude, she carried the weight of a lifetime of discipline and hard-won respect. Her dark eyes took in the polished leather seats around her, the low murmur of conversations that faded in and out, the warm lighting that bathed the room in a golden glow. The faint aroma of her herbal tea was a small comfort in the whirlwind of thoughts racing through her. It was one of those rare, quiet moments that travel sometimes allowed. But for Andrea, the airport lounge was more than just a place to wait. It was a sanctuary, a small pause in a life driven by purpose and responsibility. Outside the lounge's tall glass windows, planes were lining up on the tarmac, and the setting sun painted the sky in deep strokes of orange and pink. The scene looked almost serene, but Andrea's thoughts were far from calm. In less than 12 hours, she would be on her way to Washington, D.C., for a high-stakes military summit that could change everything. It wasn't the kind of meeting that would be written about in the news. The summit was billed as a discussion on national defense in a new era, a bland title that covered the tense negotiations and hidden agendas that would fill the room. Andrea knew this was no ordinary gathering of officials. Powerful people with secret alliances, private ambitions, and endless resources would be in that room. On paper, the goal was to strategize for the future. But Andrea knew better. She could sense the currents beneath the surface, the whispers of those who wanted to keep things as they were, who valued profit over soldiers' lives, who turned a blind eye to corruption. For Andrea, the summit was her battlefield, a place to fight for real change, to force the powerful to confront the truth. She had spent the last few months poring over classified files and reports that revealed something far darker than she could have imagined. Documents detailing the shortcuts and shady deals that lined the pockets of defense contractors but left soldiers without the equipment they needed to survive. Faulty radios, defective body armor, drones that failed in critical moments. She had seen soldiers' lives ended because someone, somewhere, cut corners to make a profit. The realization had haunted her, fueling the anger that now simmered beneath her calm exterior. She took a sip of her tea, not even noticing that it had gone cold. Her mind drifted back to West Point, where her journey had begun. She'd been a young woman full of ambition, one of the few black women in her class, aware that she would always have to work harder, be sharper, stronger. She'd learned to ignore the whispers, the looks, the quiet insinuations that her accomplishments were somehow less because of the color of her skin. And here she was now, a general, and still, there were those who doubted her. A sudden commotion near the lounge entrance snapped her back to the present. Andrea looked up and saw a tall, broad-shouldered man in an expensive suit storming toward the reception desk. His face was red with anger, and even from across the room, Andrea could hear his harsh voice, loud and cutting. "I paid for this seat, and I'm not moving for anyone," he barked, his tone sharp with entitlement. "I don't care if it's the president himself." At first, she dismissed the scene as typical entitled behavior. But as the man's voice grew louder, his words reached her ears and stopped her cold. "I'm not moving for some affirmative action hire who thinks they're entitled to special treatment just because of the color of their skin." Andrea felt a surge of anger rise within her, cold and sharp. Her grip tightened around the teacup, the ceramic heart against her palm as she processed what he had just said. She realized then that the person he was so vehemently opposed to sharing first class with was her. Andrea set her cup down slowly, methodically, and looked up. Her gaze fell upon the man, whose back was still to her, as he continued to rant, oblivious to the weight of the eyes now watching him. "I earned my place," he was saying. "I'll be damned if I'm disrespected by someone who got a free pass." With a calm that belied the storm brewing inside her, Andrea rose from her seat. Every eye in the lounge followed her as she approached him, her steps quiet but commanding, the air around her thick with tension. She reached him just as he turned, his sneer fading into shock as he looked up at her. He was tall, but Andrea's presence seemed to tower over him. Her uniform, perfectly tailored, bore the insignia of her rank, general. For a moment, the man was silent, his mouth slightly open as he registered who she was. Andrea's dark eyes met his, unblinking, her expression unreadable, but her power unmistakable. This was no ordinary passenger standing before him, and she could see his realization dawning in the paling of his face. Finally, she spoke, her voice low, steady, with a quiet strength that cut through the silence of the room. "You might want to rethink your words," she said, her tone edged with steel, "because you're not just speaking to a passenger. You're speaking to a United States Army general, and I have earned every single stripe on this uniform." The room went utterly silent. The man looked like he was about to speak, but no words came. Andrea continued, her voice calm but unyielding. "If you want to talk about entitlement, we could do that, but I assure you, this isn't a conversation you'll win." Without another word, she turned to the receptionist and nodded. "I'll take my seat now." As she walked away, she could feel the eyes on her, and she held her head high. This was just one more battle in a long line of them. And like every battle she'd ever fought, she would rise above it, because she knew she was fighting for something far greater than herself. The hum of the jet engines was a familiar, almost soothing sound as General Andrea Walker leaned back in her first-class seat. Gazing out the window, the plane lifted from the tarmac, breaking through the clouds, and for a moment, she let herself be taken in by the view. Orange and pink hues bled together on the horizon, coloring the sky in an unexpected, fragile beauty. But as the ground faded beneath her, the weight of everything she carried didn't. There, at 30,000 feet above the world, the concern she should have left behind in the airport lounge rose up again. Her thoughts returned to the summit waiting for her in Washington, D.C. It wasn't just another military meeting. For Andrea, it felt more like the battle of a lifetime, fought not with weapons, but with will and unwavering truth. She would be facing the highest-ranking officers, politicians, and defense contractors, powerful men and women who, beneath their polished titles, fought to keep a status quo that was rotting from the inside. Her eyes flicked to the worn, leather-bound notebooks sitting beside her. Inside, each page was filled with names, dates, and details, small marks that would become her ammunition. She had spent months gathering these notes, combing through classified files, piecing together a dark pattern of neglect and corruption that stretched far beyond a few faulty radios. As the details came into focus, a painful clarity had settled in her chest. Soldiers, good soldiers, had died because corners were cut, protocols ignored, and profits prioritized over lives. And yet, for all her resolve, she knew what awaited her. Andrea had fought her entire career to prove herself. She had fought to be seen, to be respected, to rise above every stereotype and dismissive glance. It hadn't been easy, especially not as a black woman in the armed forces. She remembered the whispers at West Point, the doubting eyes of her instructors, the quiet resentment of peers who had viewed her success as a box checked for diversity rather than the result of her hard work. Twice as hard. Andrea, twice as strong. Her father's words echoed in her memory, his face as vivid as if he were sitting across from her now. A Vietnam veteran himself, he had taught her what it meant to serve, despite a country that often failed to serve them in return. He'd always told her to never give anyone a reason to doubt her, to carry herself with pride and dignity, and to let her actions speak louder than any prejudice. As the plane cruised through the sky, Andrea closed her eyes for a moment, letting those words settle over her like armor. Her father had always been her hero, the man who stood tall no matter the battle he faced. He had been her strength when she thought she had none left, her reminder that every struggle could be overcome if you believed in your purpose. But now, Andrea faced a struggle that even he had never prepared her for. She wasn't just fighting for her place in the military anymore. She was fighting against a system that had perfected the art of shielding the powerful and silencing those who dared to expose the truth. In the past few months, Andrea had uncovered a disturbing thread that led back to the biggest names in defense contracting. These corporations had cut costs, supplied faulty equipment, and accepted lies as collateral damage, all while securing billion-dollar contracts with ease. And the man responsible for keeping them safe in the shadows? General Martin Chase, a towering figure in the military world and the architect of the very system Andrea sought to dismantle. Her fingers brushed the edge of the leather notebook. Inside was a list of soldiers' names, those who had been failed by the very institution that was meant to protect them. Their faces were etched in her mind. Young men and women who had trusted their leaders, trusted the equipment given to them, only to find themselves alone, defenseless in the face of failure. Some had returned home in caskets, and others with scars, both visible and hidden. Andrea could still hear the hollow sound of their names read aloud during memorial services, could still feel the sting of knowing that they had been let down by the people meant to protect them. Her resolve hardened, cutting through her exhaustion and fear. This was why she had come. This was why she had gathered every shred of evidence, every report, every whisper from whistleblowers who had risked everything to tell the truth. She owed it to those soldiers and to every future recruit to see this fight through, to expose the negligence and greed that had taken so many lives. But she knew it wouldn't be easy. Andrea would be walking into that summit like stepping into enemy territory. General Chase and his allies would be waiting, ready to crush any attempt to challenge them. The deeper she dug into her investigation, the more she realized that the corruption she'd uncovered wasn't an isolated incident, but a cancer that had spread to the highest levels. People in Chase's position had learned to see every accusation, every whistleblower, as a mere obstacle to their power. And Andrea wasn't naive. She understood that powerful people, when threatened, fought back. She had no illusions about what was coming. The flight attendant's soft voice pulled her from her thoughts, offering her a drink. Andrea waved her off with a polite smile, her mind already shifting back to the summit. With a steady hand, she pulled the thick folder of documents from her bag, her eyes scanning the names of the contractors, each tied to negligence and cover-ups. Each page told a story of betrayal, a system that turned a blind eye to soldiers' suffering and deaths for the sake of profit. And it was all there, in black and white. But even as she felt the righteous anger burn inside her, a shadow of doubt crept in. She was one person, one voice among a crowd of powerful men and women who had everything to lose. And yet, she couldn't help but wonder if that was enough. Could she really stand against the entire military-industrial complex? Or would she be crushed beneath it? But just as quickly, she pushed the thought aside. Doubt was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not now. She had spent years fighting battles no one thought she could win. And each time, she had emerged stronger, prouder. This was no different. For too long, she had watched from the sidelines as corruption festered and excuses were made. And she had vowed that one day, when she had the power, she would be the one to make a difference. As the plane leveled off, Andrea sat back and gazed out at the clouds stretching endlessly around her. Somewhere out there, her father's spirit lingered. She was sure of it. He'd always been the one to remind her that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to keep going despite it. He had believed in her. And now, more than ever, she needed to believe in herself. Andrea closed her eyes, feeling the weight of everything she carried. In a few short hours, she would be stepping into a room with men and women who had built careers on ignoring people like her, silencing people like her. But this time, she wouldn't be silent. She would bring with her the voices of every soldier, every family member left behind, every person who had trusted the military to do right by them. When the plane finally began its descent, Andrea gripped her notebook with steady hands. She wasn't just a general on her way to a meeting. She was a soldier on her way to battle. And this time, her victory wouldn't be measured in medals or promotions. It would be in the truth brought to light, in the changes that would ripple out long after she was gone. The summit awaited, and with it, the chance to finally confront the darkness lurking in the shadows of the institution she had devoted her life to. For Andrea, the stakes couldn't be higher. Her legacy, her father's legacy, and the future of countless soldiers depended on what she did next. With her head held high, Andrea prepared to face the fight of her life. The convention center loomed before General Andrea Walker, a sprawling fortress of glass and steel that seemed to tower over everything around it. As she stood at the entrance, she could feel the intensity of the moment settle heavily on her shoulders. This was no ordinary meeting place. Behind these walls, hidden in sleek conference rooms and behind closed doors, power was wielded, deals were struck, and lives were changed. Today, Andrea would step into those rooms not as a silent observer, but as a force ready to challenge everything they stood for. She adjusted the collar of her uniform, feeling the crisp fabric press against her skin. Her general's insignia gleamed under the harsh afternoon light, a symbol of the authority she had spent her life earning. And yet, it was more than just a symbol today. Her rank was her shield and her weapon, a testament to the battles she had fought, the countless hours of training, the quiet sacrifices. It was the weight of her journey, condensed into metal and fabric, and it grounded her as she prepared to face the opposition waiting inside. Andrea pushed through the revolving doors into the bustling lobby, instantly feeling the shift in energy. Officers in uniform, contractors in expensive suits, and aides clutching briefcases moved with purpose through the space. Their voices low, their expressions serious. The tension was palpable, a silent reminder that everyone here was aware that this summit was unlike any that had come before. Rumors had swirled for weeks, talk of investigations, of whispers from whistleblowers, of accusations that could shake the very foundations of the military-industrial complex. She could feel eyes on her as she walked, some curious, others wary, and she straightened her back, her gaze fixed forward. The silence she carried with her was a silence of intent, of purpose. She was not here to be another voice in the crowd. She was here to speak truth to power. And every person in this lobby, consciously or not, could feel the gravity she carried. As she approached the check-in desk, a young aide snapped to attention, his face pale as he fumbled with the tablet in his hands. "General Walker," he stammered, eyes wide. "Welcome to the summit. We have you down for the main briefing this evening. Do you need assistance with your accommodations?" Andrea nodded, giving him a polite but firm smile. "Thank you, Lieutenant, but I've got everything I need. Just point me toward the briefing room." The aide gestured quickly down a long, polished hallway, relief flickering across his face as he realized she didn't need anything further. Andrea thanked him again and headed down the corridor, her footsteps echoing off the marble floors. As she walked, she could feel the memories of the past few months surface, filling her with renewed resolve. This was the moment she had been building toward, piece by piece. She remembered the voices of whistleblowers, former employees of defense contractors who had risked everything to tell her the truth. They had shared stories of ignored safety protocols, bribes that lined the pockets of powerful men, and cost-cutting measures that placed soldiers' lives in peril. And it wasn't just small mistakes, it was a culture, a systemic negligence that allowed some of the world's largest defense contractors to grow fat on government money while delivering equipment that was unfit for the field. As she neared the doors of the main briefing room, Andrea steeled herself, knowing what awaited her. These weren't just contractors or corporate executives. Seated behind those doors were powerful men with deep ties to the military, politics, and the sprawling web of influence that made up the defense industry. And among them, she knew, was General Martin Chase. Chase was a legend, a four-star general with decades of experience and a reputation that made him almost untouchable. He was a towering figure, not just in the military, but in the world of defense contracting. In many ways, Chase was a symbol of everything Andrea had spent her career challenging. He represented the old guard, the entrenched power that resisted change, that fought to keep the status quo no matter the cost. And today, she would be facing him head-on. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped inside. The briefing room was a cavernous space, its walls lined with thick panels that absorbed sound, ensuring that the conversations within would remain contained. Rows of chairs were set up in front of a large stage where a massive screen displayed the agenda for the day. High-ranking officers, civilian defense officials, and suited contractors filled the seats, their low conversations falling silent as Andrea entered. She took a seat near the front, her eyes scanning the room. Familiar faces surrounded her, generals she had served with, men and women she had seen in action, and others she knew only from reputation. But it was General Martin Chase who captured her attention. He sat near the stage, his imposing frame as steady as a mountain, his gaze cool and unreadable. Chase's eyes flickered to her for the briefest moment, a look that seemed to assess, to calculate. And in that instant, Andrea knew that he was aware of what she had brought with her, of the evidence she intended to present. He was ready for her, and he was prepared to fight. Chase took his place at the podium, and the room fell silent. His voice, deep and resonant, filled the space as he outlined the summit's goals: innovation, security, and the future of warfare. But to Andrea, his words were nothing more than carefully chosen masks. Beneath the talk of strategy, she could hear the underlying message. Chase was here to maintain control, to keep the system intact. He was here to make sure that people like her, those who dared to question the system, were kept in check. As the briefing dragged on, Andrea's mind churned. She knew that soon she would be called into a closed-door meeting with Chase and the other power players in the room. It was behind those doors, in the privacy of a select few, that the real conversations would take place, the ones that would decide whether her evidence would be allowed to see the light of day or be buried. Along with her career, when the main briefing ended, Andrea rose and made her way toward the exit, keeping her gaze steady as she moved through the crowd. As she passed by Chase, their eyes met once more, and this time she saw something in his gaze, a flicker of understanding, of a man who knew exactly what he was up against and who was already planning his next move. Andrea felt a chill run down her spine, but she held her head high, unflinching. She had known that this fight would be dangerous, that it would require every ounce of her strength and resolve. But in that moment, facing Chase, she felt the enormity of what she was up against. This was a man who would stop at nothing to keep his power, a man who would not hesitate to destroy anyone who threatened the world he had built. As she stepped out of the briefing room and into the quiet hallway, Andrea's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and read the message from an unknown number. "You don't know what you're getting into. Stop before it's too late." She stared at the words, her heartbeat quickening. The message was short, but its implications were clear. The forces she was challenging were powerful, and they weren't just going to sit back and let her expose them. They would come for her quietly, ruthlessly, in ways that left no trace. But even as the threat loomed over her, Andrea felt her resolve harden. She slipped her phone back into her pocket, the weight of the message settling alongside her determination. She was walking into a storm, one that would test every part of her, but she had spent her life preparing for this. With one final look at the closed doors of the briefing room, Andrea turned and walked down the hall, her steps steady, her focus clear. The shadows were closing in, but she had never been one to run from the darkness. Instead, she would face it head-on, a soldier stepping into battle, ready to fight for a future built on truth. The doors to the private conference room closed with a quiet but final thud, sealing Andrea Walker inside with some of the most powerful figures in the military-industrial complex. The sound echoed in her mind, a reminder that there was no turning back. She was here, face to face with the very people who stood to lose the most if she succeeded. The room was cavernous yet intimate, the thick walls absorbing every sound to keep their discussion completely private. The air felt heavy, charged with unspoken tensions and hidden agendas. Around the long, polished table sat generals with rows of medals across their chests, Pentagon officials, and the heads of a few key defense contractors, including those from Armatech Industries. Andrea's eyes swept over each face, taking in a blend of power, confidence, and, in a few cases, barely veiled hostility. She met each gaze with an unflinching calm, feeling the weight of her responsibility settle over her. At the head of the table, like an immovable force, sat General Martin Chase. He was the sun around which the others orbited, his presence a constant reminder of the old power that had shaped this world. Chase's face was unreadable, his expression as hard as granite. But Andrea could feel the challenge in his eyes, the unspoken warning. He knew what she had come here to do, and he would do everything in his power to stop her. Andrea had chosen her seat deliberately, directly across from Chase, a silent statement that she was here to confront him head-on. As everyone settled in, she took a slow, measured breath, her gaze steady and unyielding. This was the moment she had prepared for, the culmination of months of gathering evidence, of conversations with whistleblowers who had risked everything to tell her the truth. The meeting began with the usual formalities. Each person introduced themselves, their titles rolling off their tongues with rehearsed ease. But Andrea barely heard them. Her mind was already turning over the words she would say, the evidence she would present. This was no ordinary briefing. She was about to shine a light on corruption that had festered for too long, risking her career, her reputation, and perhaps even more. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the conversation shifted to the procurement processes and defense contracts. It was her opening, the moment she had been waiting for. The executives from Armatech exchanged knowing glances, each of them perfectly calm, their expressions betraying nothing. Chase remained impassive, his gaze steady and unreadable. He was waiting, she realized, waiting to see how far she would go. One of the generals, a man Andrea had served with on previous operations, spoke up first, his tone light but laced with seriousness. We've had some issues with the latest round of equipment from Armatech. Faulty radios. I believe it's likely a small issue, but it does need to be addressed. Andrea felt a surge of anger rise within her. A small issue? The words echoed in her mind, a reminder of how easily lives could be dismissed as minor inconveniences. She cleared her throat, her voice cutting through the air with a quiet, undeniable force. It's more than just faulty radios. General, she said, her gaze sweeping the room. What we're dealing with here is systemic negligence. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to her, some curious, others skeptical. Chase's expression didn't change, but she caught a flicker of something in his gaze, a recognition that the moment he had been dreading had arrived. Systemic negligence? One of the Pentagon officials leaned forward, his tone skeptical. General Walker, that's a serious accusation. Andrea held his gaze, her voice steady. And it's a serious problem. Over the past few months, I've conducted an investigation into equipment supplied by Armatech Industries. What I found is a disturbing pattern of cost-cutting measures, ignored safety protocols, and defective products that have put our soldiers' lives at risk. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick folder, sliding it across the table. These are the reports, she said firmly. Testimonies from whistleblowers within the company, field reports from deployed units, and internal documents showing a clear disregard for safety. Soldiers have died because of this negligence. The silence was absolute. Andrea could feel the tension tightening around her, the kind of tension that felt like it could snap at any moment. She knew what she had just presented was explosive. She could almost feel the weight of Chase's anger simmering beneath his cold expression. Chase finally spoke, his voice calm but laced with steel. These are very serious claims, General Walker, but we have processes in place to address issues like this. If there has been negligence, the proper channels will investigate it. Andrea didn't flinch. She had anticipated this response. The classic defense of bureaucracy. With all due respect, General, those channels have failed. I've been submitting reports for months, and nothing has changed. Armatech continues to win contracts, despite their disregard for soldier safety. This isn't just a failure of oversight. It's a systemic problem that's been allowed to fester because no one wants to rock the boat. Chase's eyes narrowed, his expression darkening as he absorbed her words. What exactly are you suggesting, Walker? That the entire procurement system is corrupt? She met his gaze with unyielding resolve. I'm suggesting that we need accountability, that we need to stop awarding contracts to companies that put profits above lives. Armatech Industries is a prime example. They've been getting away with it for years, and it's time someone held them responsible. One of the Armatech executives, a man with graying hair and a polished demeanor, leaned forward, his voice smooth but firm. General Walker, with all due respect, our company has provided invaluable services to the military for decades. We operate under strict guidelines and regulations. If there have been issues, we are fully committed to addressing them. Andrea met his gaze, her expression unwavering. Your company has had years to address these issues, and nothing has changed. Soldiers are still dying because of your negligence. How many more lives will it take before you're willing to make real changes? The executive shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but before he could respond, Chase intervened, his voice colder than before. This is not the place for accusations. General Walker, we are here to discuss the future of military strategy, not to launch personal attacks on our contractors. Andrea's anger flared, but she forced herself to remain calm, her voice steady. This is about the future of the military. General, if we continue to allow companies like Armatech to operate without accountability, we're not just putting lives at risk, we're undermining the very principles we're supposed to stand for. Chase's jaw tightened, and for a moment, the room was silent. She could feel the weight of every gaze on her, some of them shocked, others clearly uncomfortable. She knew she was risking everything, but she couldn't back down, not now. You're walking a fine line. Walker, Chase said, his voice low and dangerous. You're not just challenging a contractor, you're challenging the entire system. She met his gaze, her heart pounding, but her resolve unshaken. Maybe it's time the system was challenged. For a moment, no one spoke. The tension in the room was like a coiled spring, the silence heavy with the weight of unspoken threats. Andrea knew she was standing on the edge, that by speaking out, she was risking not only her career but her entire future. Finally, Chase leaned back in his chair, a slow, calculating smile spreading across his face. We'll see about that. With that, the meeting was adjourned. People began to file out, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, concern, and something else, fear of what might come next, of the battle that had just begun. As Andrea gathered her things, she felt a hand on her arm. She turned to see one of her few allies, a fellow general who had supported her from the beginning. His expression was grave, his voice low. You've made a powerful enemy today. Andrea, he said quietly. Be careful. She nodded, her expression hard. I know, but I can't stand by and let this continue. Her ally hesitated, then gave her a small nod. Just watch your back. Chase isn't the type to lose quietly. Andrea watched him walk away, her mind already racing with the implications of what had just happened. She had known this fight would be difficult, but now it was clear just how deep the opposition ran. Chase, Armatech, and the entire corrupt system they represented would not back down without a fight. But neither would she. As she stepped out of the conference room and into the dimly lit hallway, she knew that the storm was coming, and she was ready. Andrea Walker sat in her hotel room, the city lights of Washington, D.C., flickering against the darkening sky outside her window. She watched them absently, her mind far from the calm glow of the skyline. She felt as if she were standing on a tightrope, every move calculated, each choice fraught with consequence. The confrontation with General Martin Chase had shaken her, not because she doubted her mission, but because of the sheer magnitude of the fight she had willingly stepped into. The silence of the room was broken by a soft knock on the door. Instinctively, she moved toward it, her body tense. She'd been expecting a visit, but that didn't mean she wasn't cautious. Peering through the peephole, she saw the familiar face of Colonel Daniel Jackson. She exhaled slowly and opened the door. Jackson stepped in, his expression serious, his gaze scanning the room before he closed the door behind him. Andrea had known Jackson for years. They'd served together in Afghanistan, and he was one of the few people she trusted implicitly. He looked at her with a mixture of respect and concern, his voice low. We need to talk, he said, his tone heavy. Andrea motioned for him to sit, her gaze sharp, focused. What's happened? Jackson wasted no time. His words clipped. Chase isn't just letting this go. Andrea, he's already working to discredit you. Rumors are circulating about your mental fitness for command. They're saying you're unstable, reckless, anything to plant doubt. Andrea clenched her fists, the anger simmering under her calm exterior. She had expected resistance, but not this quickly, and not from so many angles. Of course they are. It's classic damage control. Discredit the messenger so no one believes the message. Jackson's expression darkened. It's worse than that. I'm hearing whispers of an internal investigation. They're claiming you mishandled classified information, that your actions have jeopardized national security. They're setting you up, Andrea. She let the words sink in, the truth of them filling her with a steely determination. Chase wasn't just trying to discredit her. He was moving to eliminate her as a threat entirely. If they succeeded, she wouldn't just lose her career, she could lose her freedom. Her voice was steady, though a storm raged inside. They're laying the groundwork to take me down before I can expose them. They know I have the evidence, and they'll do anything to keep it buried. Jackson nodded grimly. Exactly. You're not just dealing with Chase. He's got people in high places covering for him. This goes all the way to the top. Andrea, they're not going to let you reveal what you know without a fight. Andrea paced across the room, her mind racing through the options. She'd prepared for this, but the speed and precision of their counterattack were shocking. If I try to go public through official channels, they'll bury me before I even get a chance. I need to take this outside the chain of command. Jackson raised an eyebrow. Cautious. You're talking about going to the press? She stopped pacing, her gaze hard. Yes, it's the only way to make sure the truth gets out. If I go public, I'll have the weight of public opinion behind me. Chase and his allies won't be able to silence this if everyone is watching. Jackson hesitated, then nodded, understanding the gravity of her decision. If you go public, you'll need someone you can trust, a journalist who can handle the pressure, someone with reach and credibility. Andrea didn't hesitate. Cynthia Shaw. Jackson's eyes widened slightly in recognition. Shaw? The investigative reporter? She's taken down politicians, COs. She's not easily intimidated. Andrea nodded. Exactly. Shaw's one of the few journalists who hasn't been bought off. If I give her the evidence, she'll make sure it sees the light of day. A tense silence filled the room as Jackson absorbed her plan. He looked at her, his expression serious. Andrea, once you do this, there's no going back. You'll be putting a target on your back. Not just from Chase, but from anyone who's connected to this. She met his gaze, her voice unwavering. I know, but I can't stay silent. This isn't just about me. It's about every soldier who trusted us, who trusted that the military would protect them. I won't let their sacrifices be used to line the pockets of greedy contractors. Jackson nodded, his respect for her clear. All right, I'll help you get in touch with Shaw and make sure everything's in place. But be careful, Andrea. Chase isn't the type to lose quietly. Andrea took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her decision settle over her. This was the moment. She would be stepping into the spotlight, bringing her evidence into the public eye, and daring the powers that be to silence her. But she had spent her life fighting for justice, for truth, and she wouldn't back down now. The next morning, Andrea left the hotel under the cover of dawn, her steps quick as she headed to the coffee shop where she'd arranged to meet Shaw. The city was quiet, the streets empty, but Andrea felt the tension beneath the calm. This was it, the moment she'd been building toward. She felt a strange sense of peace as she walked, her purpose clear, her determination unbreakable. When she arrived, Shaw was already there, seated in a corner booth. She was dressed casually, her blonde hair tied back, her sharp eyes fixed on Andrea as she approached. Shaw rose to shake her hand, her grip firm. General Walker. Shaw greeted, her voice professional but curious. I have to say, I didn't expect to hear from you. Andrea gave a small, tight smile. I don't have much time, so let's get to it. She handed Shaw the thick folder, watching as the journalist opened it and began to skim through the pages. Andrea could see the shift in Shaw's expression, the initial curiosity deepening into something darker as she absorbed the contents. The evidence was damning. Every page a piece of the puzzle that revealed a culture of corruption and negligence. And at the center of it, General Chase. "This is unbelievable," Shaw murmured, her voice laced with anger. "You're telling me they've been knowingly supplying faulty equipment, putting soldiers' lives at risk, and no one's been held accountable?" Andrea nodded, her voice hard. "Exactly. Chase has been protecting Armatech for years, shielding them from investigations, securing contracts. Soldiers have died. Shaw, and they covered it up." Shaw looked up, her eyes fierce. "You realize what this means, don't you? Once this story breaks, they'll come after you with everything they have." Andrea met her gaze, her voice steady. "I know, but it's worth it. People need to know the truth. And if I have to be the one to pay the price, so be it." Shaw nodded, respect evident in her expression. "All right, I'll get to work on this. I'll make sure every fact is bulletproof. Once this story goes live, they won't be able to bury it." Andrea felt a surge of relief, tempered by the awareness that this was only the beginning. But before she could feel any sense of security, her phone buzzed, a message lighting up her screen. "They know." Her blood ran cold as the implications settled in. She looked up at Shaw, urgency in her voice. "We need to move quickly. They're already on to me. Once this story breaks, they'll come after you too." Shaw didn't flinch. "Let them try. I've faced worse. But we need to be smart. I'll make sure everything's ready before we publish." Andrea nodded, her heartbeat steady but intense. Shaw gathered the documents, placing them in her bag, and gave Andrea one final, firm handshake. "Stay safe. General, I'll be in touch." Andrea watched her leave, a sense of both victory and dread settling over her. The truth was out there now, in the hands of someone who could amplify it, give it weight. But she knew Chase wouldn't wait for the story to break before he made his move. As if on cue, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from Jackson, his voice tense. "Andrea, I just got word from a contact at the Pentagon. They're moving to arrest you." "For what?" she asked, her voice low and urgent. "They're claiming you leaked classified information and compromised national security. It's a setup." "Andrea, Chase is making his move." Andrea's mind raced. She had anticipated retaliation, but not this quickly, and not so ruthlessly. "How long do I have?" "Not long. I've arranged a safe house. Get there and lay low until this story goes live." Andrea didn't waste a second. She left the coffee shop, her steps quick and calculated. The net was closing around her, and every instinct told her that Chase would stop at nothing to silence her before the story could break. But as she moved through the crowded streets, her heart pounding, she felt a strange sense of calm. They could chase her. They could try to silence her. But the truth was out now, and she would keep moving, keep fighting until it was too big to ignore. As she slipped into the shadowed alleys of the city, Andrea knew that whatever happened next, she was ready. She would face the storm head-on, one soldier against an army of shadows, and she would not back down. Andrea moved swiftly through the early morning shadows of Washington, D.C., her heartbeat quick but steady. She had learned long ago how to control fear, to let it fuel her focus rather than paralyze her. The only sounds were her own footsteps against the pavement and the faint hum of the city waking up around her. Somewhere in the depths of the Pentagon, Chase and his allies were tightening their net, and she knew she had little time before they closed in. Every step she took felt like a countdown ticking in her mind. With each second, her window of escape narrowed, and the threats loomed closer. Jackson had arranged for a safe house about 20 minutes from her current location. She just had to make it there undetected. She slipped her hand into her coat pocket, her fingers curling around the small flash drive containing everything she had uncovered. It held copies of the classified files, testimonies from whistleblowers, records of fraudulent contracts and cost-cutting measures that had put soldiers' lives at risk. It was her insurance policy, her way of ensuring that even if she were silenced, the truth would survive. Turning a corner, Andrea caught a glimpse of two black SUVs in her peripheral vision. Her instincts kicked in immediately, and she ducked into a narrow alley, pressing her back against the cold brick wall. She held her breath, her pulse pounding in her ears as she listened to the low rumble of engines passing by. She couldn't afford to be caught now, not when she was this close. After the vehicles had gone, she continued, keeping to the shadows, her thoughts racing. She couldn't help but think of how quickly things had unraveled. Only days ago, she had been a respected general with the trust of her peers. Now, she was a fugitive, forced to hide, carrying secrets that could bring down some of the most powerful people in the country. Chase's reach was long, and his allies were numerous, but she refused to let them silence her. Her phone buzzed, startling her out of her thoughts. She checked it, and her stomach tightened. It was a message from Jackson. They know about the safe house. Change course. Meet me at Plan B location. Andrea took a steadying breath. This wasn't surprising. Chase's network was vast, and no place was entirely safe. Plan B meant she would have to navigate the labyrinthine backstreets of the city. But she trusted Jackson. They had prepared for this possibility. She slipped the phone back into her pocket, adjusting her pace, weaving through alleys and side streets, every instinct on high alert. As she moved, her mind ran through every detail, every calculation. There was no room for error. She wasn't just protecting herself. She was protecting the story, the truth she was determined to bring to light. If she failed, soldiers would continue to die for the greed and negligence of people like Chase. As she neared the new meeting spot, a quiet park surrounded by towering buildings, she scanned her surroundings, eyes darting for any sign of pursuit. The tension felt thick, wrapping around her like a noose. She spotted Jackson waiting near a secluded bench, his posture tense as he watched her approach. His eyes were alert, scanning the area as she came up beside him. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low, eyes still scanning for any potential threat. She nodded, her voice steady. "For now." "They're moving faster than I anticipated." Jackson clenched his jaw, his frustration evident. "Chase is throwing everything at you. They're calling in favors, making you out to be a threat to national security. I've never seen them move this fast." Andrea took a breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "If they're this desperate, it means we're close. They're scared of what's coming." Jackson gave her a hard look. "I know, but it also means we're running out of options. They'll lock down every route soon, if they haven't already." He glanced down at the flash drive in her hand, understanding its significance. "Is that all of it?" She nodded. "Everything I've gathered. Even if they catch me, this can still get out." Jackson's expression softened, admiration evident in his eyes. "You're braver than most. Andrea, they've turned you into a villain, and you're still willing to risk it all for this." She met his gaze, her voice unwavering. "I didn't come this far just to watch them sweep it all under the rug. Too many people have sacrificed too much for that." Jackson nodded, understanding the depth of her commitment. "We need to get you out of here. I've arranged for Shaw to meet us at a secure location. She's moving fast. Her team is already prepping the story, verifying every detail. Once this breaks, Chase won't be able to control the fallout." The thought brought a flicker of hope, but Andrea knew better than to let her guard down. Chase was no stranger to crisis. He wouldn't wait for the story to break before he made his next move. As they began to move through the park, Andrea noticed shadows flickering along the edges of her vision. She didn't dare turn her head, but a prickle of fear settled over her. Jackson noticed it too, his posture stiffening. "We got company." Andrea kept her pace steady, her voice barely a whisper. "How close?" "Close enough," he replied, his tone grim. "We need to get out of sight, now." They veered toward a side exit, slipping into the narrow alley beyond. Andrea's pulse quickened as footsteps echoed behind them. She glanced back, catching sight of two men in dark suits, their faces cold and focused. "Agents." Jackson grabbed her arm, pulling her forward. "There's a service entrance up ahead. If we can get inside, we can lose them." They ducked into the doorway just as one of the agents shouted. Heart pounding, Andrea followed Jackson down a dimly lit staircase, her footsteps blending with the thudding rhythm of her heart. The basement hallway they entered was deserted, echoing with the faint hum of machinery. They moved quickly, navigating a maze of corridors that twisted and turned in disorienting directions. Finally, they found a small exit leading to another alley. Jackson pushed open the door, and they stepped into the cold air, the faint dawn light casting long shadows across the brick walls. They moved quickly through the alley, emerging onto a quiet street. Jackson flagged down a car that was waiting for them, a simple, unmarked vehicle driven by a trusted ally. Andrea slipped inside, Jackson close behind, and they pulled away from the curb just as the agents rounded the corner behind them. They drove in tense silence for several minutes, Andrea's mind racing as they put distance between themselves and the agents. Finally, Jackson spoke. "We're taking you straight to Shaw. We have to move fast before they catch on." The car turned down several side streets, navigating the city's early morning calm. As they neared their destination, Jackson looked over at her, his voice serious. "This is it, Andrea. Once the story goes live, there's no going back. They'll try to discredit you, tear you apart. Are you sure you're ready for that?" She met his gaze, her voice resolute. "I've spent my entire career fighting for justice, Jackson. I won't stop now." The car pulled to a stop in front of a nondescript building. Andrea felt a surge of nerves as she stepped out, gripping the flash drive tightly. This was her chance, her final opportunity to bring the truth to light. Jackson gave her an encouraging nod, his hand briefly resting on her shoulder. "Go," he said quietly. "I'll cover you." Andrea stepped into the building, her heart pounding as she moved toward the elevator. The hallways were quiet, her footsteps echoing as she made her way to the room where Shaw was waiting. Inside, Shaw looked up as she entered, her face focused and intense. She motioned for Andrea to sit, her expression determined. "Everything's ready. Once you give me the final files, I'll publish." Andrea handed over the flash drive, feeling the weight of it lift from her hands. She watched as Shaw plugged it in, her fingers flying over the keyboard, the evidence coming to life on the screen before them. Andrea's phone buzzed. A text message from Jackson. "They're on their way. Stay safe." Her chest tightened, but she pushed the fear aside. The truth was about to be unleashed, and nothing would stop it now. Shaw glanced over at her, her voice calm but fierce. "You've done something incredible, Andrea. This will change everything." Andrea managed a small, grateful smile. She felt a sense of peace, of purpose. No matter what happened next, she had done her part. The truth was out there, and Chase could no longer control it. Outside, the faint sounds of sirens echoed, but Andrea felt only a calm resolve. Whatever storm came next, she was ready to face it head-on. Andrea Walker sat across from Cynthia Shaw in the dimly lit room, watching as the journalist finished reading through the last document. Shaw's fingers tapped rhythmically against her keyboard as she absorbed the story piece by piece, her expression a mix of shock, determination, and barely concealed fury. Andrea could feel the weight of every word, every damning detail finally set in motion to expose the rot within the military system she had dedicated her life to. Cynthia closed the laptop with a deliberate click, her sharp gaze meeting Andrea's. "This story is going to rock the foundation of the military, and Chase knows it. Once I publish, it will be unstoppable. But are you ready for what comes next?" Andrea nodded, her face calm, but her mind racing. "I didn't come this far to back down. The truth has to come out. No more soldiers should die because of their greed." Outside, the early morning light filtered through the window, casting faint shadows that seemed to pulse with the gravity of what was about to happen. They both knew that once this story went live, there would be no way to reverse course. Chase and his allies would fight back with every tool at their disposal. They would stop at nothing to bury her. But as Cynthia Shaw's fingers poised over her laptop, ready to publish the story that would change everything, Andrea felt a strange sense of calm. She had spent her life preparing for battles. But this one was different. This was a fight for truth, for justice, and for every soldier who had been betrayed by the very system sworn to protect them. A sudden knock on the door broke the silence, and both women exchanged a tense glance. Shaw looked through the peephole, her expression hardening. "It's Jackson," she murmured before opening the door. Colonel Daniel Jackson stepped inside, his face grim and his posture tense. Chase's people are moving in. I've seen agents near the building, and I can guarantee they're not here for a friendly chat. Andrea's jaw tightened, her heartbeat steady but fierce. Let them come. The story is going live in minutes. Jackson shook his head, his eyes filled with urgency. They're planning to arrest you. Andrea, it's not just about stopping the story. They're framing this as treason. You're officially a fugitive, and they'll do whatever it takes to bring you in. Andrea took a deep breath, letting his words settle over her. She had known this would happen, that Chase would pull every string he could to bury her. But now, standing on the brink of exposure, she felt a fire ignite within her. She wasn't afraid, she was ready. Cynthia's voice was calm but determined. I'll release it now, and I'll have backup copies sent to media outlets across the country. They won't be able to shut it down. With a single, decisive click, Shaw hit publish. Andrea felt a surge of both relief and resolve as she watched the screen flash, signaling that her story was live. The evidence was out there, unleashed for the world to see. Jackson's phone buzzed, and his expression darkened as he read the message. They're coming up the stairs. We don't have much time. Andrea looked at him, her eyes steady. Then let's make sure we use every second we have. Jackson gestured toward the fire escape, his voice low. This way. Shaw, lock everything down, and don't leave until you're sure the story is spreading. They'll come for you too. Shaw nodded, her face resolute. Don't worry about me. Just make sure she gets out safely. Andrea took one last look at Shaw, gratitude flashing in her eyes. Thank you for everything. Shaw nodded, her expression softening for a brief moment. Go, and don't look back. Andrea followed Jackson to the fire escape, slipping out into the crisp morning air. The metal steps rattled beneath their feet as they descended, the faint sound of sirens echoing through the city streets. Andrea felt the weight of every step, each one carrying her closer to an uncertain future. When they reached the alley, Jackson led her to an unmarked car waiting in the shadows. He opened the passenger door, and she slid in, her mind sharp and clear. She knew this wasn't the end, if anything. It was only the beginning. As the car pulled away from the building, Andrea watched the world blur past her, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Relief, defiance, and a deep, unshakable determination. Chase would try to discredit her, to paint her as a traitor. But the truth was out there now, and he couldn't control it. The car wound through back streets, avoiding the main roads, Jackson's gaze constantly scanning for any sign of pursuit. Andrea clutched the flash drive still in her pocket, a silent reminder of everything she had risked, of the lives she had fought to protect. Finally, Jackson broke the silence. There's a safe house on the outskirts of the city. We can lay low there while the story gains traction. Chase's reach is long, but with public attention, it'll be harder for him to act without scrutiny. Andrea nodded, her mind already racing through the possibilities. She knew Chase wouldn't back down, but she also knew she wasn't alone. The truth had a power of its own, a strength that even men like Chase couldn't fully contain. As they neared the safe house, Andrea's phone buzzed with notifications. She pulled it out, seeing headlines flooding her screen. General Walker exposes corruption in military contracts. Exclusive. Faulty equipment and secret deals endanger soldiers. Military whistleblower speaks out. The system has failed us? Each headline felt like a victory. Each article a step toward justice. She could almost hear the uproar beginning, the ripple effect of her story spreading through every corner of the nation. The public would demand answers, and the Pentagon would be forced to respond. Chase's network was strong. But now, for the first time, he was on the defensive. They pulled into the driveway of the safe house, a small, unassuming building tucked away from the main roads. As they stepped inside, Jackson locked the door behind them, his expression both relieved and weary. Andrea sank into a chair, the adrenaline slowly ebbing from her body. She knew the battle wasn't over. Chase would do everything in his power to silence her, to control the narrative. But she had made the first move, and now the game had changed. Jackson looked at her, admiration and respect in his eyes. You've done something incredible. Andrea, this isn't just a story, it's a call for accountability. People will rally behind you. Andrea nodded, exhaustion tugging at her, but her resolve unwavering. They'll try to destroy me. Jackson, but I'm ready. He gave her a small, proud smile. I know, and I'll be right there with you. The quiet settled over them, broken only by the faint hum of her phone as more alerts poured in. Andrea leaned back, her gaze fixed on the screen as she watched the world react. Chase's allies would scramble to contain the damage. But it was too late. The truth was out, and it was no longer under his control. As she sat there, a sense of peace washed over her. She had fought the battle of her life. And now, no matter what came next, she had done what she set out to do. The weight of her choices, her sacrifices, felt lighter in that moment, as if she had finally passed them on to the people who needed to carry them. Outside, the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, casting a warm glow over the safe house. Andrea closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself feel the quiet victory, knowing that whatever storm came next, she had the truth on her side. And for Andrea Walker, that was enough. The morning news crackled through the small, dimly lit safe house as Andrea and Jackson listened in silence. Every major network had picked up the story, each headline more damning than the last. Andrea could practically feel the nation waking up to the revelations, the simmering outrage spreading like wildfire. Corruption exposed at the highest levels of defense contracts. General Walker's whistleblower report sparks national outcry. Faulty equipment endangers soldiers. Who will be held accountable? Each headline was a strike against General Chase and the web of allies he had built over the years. Andrea could only imagine the panic flooding through the halls of the Pentagon. For too long, Chase had operated in the shadows, believing himself untouchable. But now, for the first time, he was forced to answer for his actions. Jackson turned off the television, glancing at her with a small smile. They're backed into a corner. Public outrage is on our side now. Andrea nodded, but she felt a flicker of apprehension beneath her resolve. Chase wouldn't go down easily. He was a man accustomed to power, someone who would burn everything around him rather than surrender control. The phone buzzed on the table, pulling Andrea from her thoughts. It was a text from Shaw. They're mobilizing. Watch your back. Andrea exchanged a look with Jackson, her eyes steely. He's not going to stop. Not until he's silenced me for good. Jackson's expression darkened, his gaze sweeping over the safe house as if searching for unseen threats. Then we stay vigilant. They'll come at you from every angle. Andrea, legal accusations, character assassination, whatever it takes to dismantle your credibility. Andrea took a steadying breath, her resolve hardening. They can try, but I won't let them intimidate me. I put everything on the line for this. I'm not backing down now. Jackson gave her a reassuring nod, but both of them knew that the battle ahead would be as fierce as any she had fought in her military career. Chase had connections within the media, the military, and the political sphere. He would try to twist the narrative, to portray her as a rogue officer who had betrayed her country. And sure enough, within hours, the first counter-narratives began to emerge. General Walker, hero or traitor? Top military official faces treason allegations amid scandal. Pentagon officials speak out. She put national security at risk. Andrea clenched her fists, her jaw tightening as she read the headlines. Chase was fast, but she had expected this. The media war was his first line of defense, his attempt to discredit her before the truth could sink into the public consciousness. She could picture him now, sitting behind his polished desk, issuing orders to shape the narrative in his favor. But Andrea knew something he didn't. The public was hungry for accountability. Soldiers' families, veterans, and citizens who had lost loved ones to faulty equipment were already speaking out, sharing their stories, adding fuel to the fire that she had sparked. Look, Jackson said, handing her his phone. On the screen was a video of a Gold Star mother, her voice filled with anger and grief. My son trusted this country, and they sent him into harm's way with faulty equipment. General Walker has given us the courage to demand answers. Andrea felt a surge of hope as she watched. This was why she had taken the risk, why she had exposed herself to Chase's wrath. The voices of those she had fought for were finally being heard. People were uniting, calling for an investigation, demanding justice. Her fight had become their fight. The doorbell rang, and Jackson's hand went instinctively to his sidearm. His body tense as he moved to the peephole. "It's Shaw," he said, relaxing slightly as he opened the door. Cynthia Shaw stepped in, her face flushed, her expression determined. "It's absolute chaos out there. Chase is scrambling, but he's losing ground. The Pentagon is being forced to respond, and more whistleblowers are coming forward." Andrea felt a rush of relief, tempered by caution. That's good news. But Chase isn't done. He'll push back harder now, and he'll use every resource he has. Shaw nodded, her face grim. "I know, and he's already trying to spin the narrative. But the truth is out there. Andrea, this story has taken on a life of its own. Even he can't control it anymore." Just then, Jackson's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it, his expression turning serious. "They're issuing a formal investigation. The Pentagon just announced they're looking into the defense contracts, including Armateka's role." Andrea took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of triumph and apprehension. This was the breakthrough she had hoped for, but it was only the beginning. Chase would fight the investigation with everything he had, and the Pentagon would be walking a tightrope, balancing public pressure with internal loyalties. Over the next few hours, they watched the story unfold. News anchors, journalists, and experts weighed in, dissecting the revelations, demanding accountability. Meanwhile, allies of Chase began to leak accusations against Andrea, claiming she had fabricated evidence, that she was mentally unstable, that she had acted out of personal vendetta. But each attempt to smear her was met with a growing wave of public support, of people who saw through the lies and demanded answers. As the day wore on, a knock came at the door. This time, it was one of Andrea's few remaining allies from within the military, General Paul Morton. His expression was grave as he stepped inside, his gaze meeting hers with a mix of respect and urgency. "Andrea," he said, his voice low, "they're going after your entire career. They're talking about stripping your rank, revoking your pension. Chase wants you erased from the record." She squared her shoulders, feeling the fire within her reignite. "Let him try. I didn't do this for my career. I did it for every soldier he betrayed." Morton nodded, his face softening. "I know, and there are others who see what you're doing. You're not alone in this." Andrea felt a flicker of hope, but she knew that even with allies, the path ahead would be treacherous. Chase's influence was vast, and the fight was far from over. The sun began to set, casting long shadows over the safe house as Andrea, Jackson, Shaw, and Morton continued to strategize, preparing for the inevitable backlash. Outside, the streets were quiet, but Andrea knew the storm was gathering. The nation was waking up, demanding change, and Chase's empire was beginning to crumble. As the night wore on, Andrea stood by the window, looking out over the city she had sworn to protect. She knew she had ignited something that couldn't be extinguished. The fight was no longer hers alone. It was a call for justice that echoed across the country. In that moment, Andrea understood that her legacy was no longer bound by her rank or her position. She had become a symbol, a rallying point for truth in the face of corruption, a voice for the silenced. Chase might strip her of her title, her rank, her pension, but he couldn't strip her of the truth. And as she looked out over the darkened city, Andrea Walker knew she would continue to fight, no matter the cost. She had lit the fire, and now she would watch as it spread, bringing light to the shadows and holding the powerful accountable for their actions. The reckoning had only just begun. The days that followed were a whirlwind of revelations, threats, and relentless media coverage. Andrea stayed in the safe house, watching from a distance as the nation grappled with the enormity of what she had exposed. Across news channels, her name had become a rallying cry for justice. While Chase's empire began to fray at the edges under the intense public scrutiny, Andrea sat at the small kitchen table, flipping through headlines on her phone. Each article, each segment, was another blow to the corrupt system she had fought so hard to reveal. But Chase was a master strategist, and she knew he wouldn't let her win without a final stand. She could feel him closing in, like a shadow creeping closer, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. Jackson entered the kitchen, carrying a stack of files he had retrieved from another ally on the inside. These just came in, internal memos from Armatech. They're panicking. Andrea. They're scrambling to cover their tracks. But it's too late. Andrea took the files, skimming through them with a growing sense of satisfaction. The walls are closing in on them. They're desperate, and desperate people make mistakes. He nodded, a hint of pride in his eyes. You've done something incredible here. The country is behind you now, but Chase won't go down without dragging you through the mud first. As if on cue, her phone buzzed with a news alert. She looked at the screen and felt a chill run down her spine. Breaking. General Walker under investigation for alleged misconduct. Military claims national security breach. Andrea's jaw tightened as she read the article, her eyes narrowing. Chase was moving faster than she'd anticipated. The article accused her of mishandling classified information, of violating protocols, and even hinted at treason. She knew it was all a ploy, a desperate attempt to turn the tide of public opinion. But the accusations were damning. Jackson leaned over her shoulder, his expression darkening. They're pulling out all the stops. This is their attempt to neutralize you before the investigation goes any further. Andrea set her phone down, her voice steady. I expected this. Chase knows he's cornered, so he's playing his last cards. But I won't back down. He gave her a hard look. We need to keep you protected. If they make this official, you'll be forced to answer these charges in court, and they'll drag it out as long as they can to stall your momentum. Andrea knew he was right. The legal process could be a quagmire, tying her up in procedural battles, draining her resources and support. But as she looked out the window, the skyline of D.C. bathed in the golden afternoon light. She felt a surge of determination. She had faced down Chase in the boardrooms of power, and she would face him in the courtroom if it came to that. Just then, her phone buzzed with a call from Shaw. Andrea answered, her voice calm. Cynthia, what's the latest? Shaw's voice was sharp, fueled by the adrenaline of a journalist in the thick of a breaking story. I just received a tip, an anonymous source from inside the Pentagon. They're saying that Chase is pressuring his allies to issue a warrant for your arrest. They're framing it as an urgent national security threat. Andrea, they're trying to bring you in now, before you can gain any more traction. Andrea's heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had expected this escalation. Chase would stop at nothing, even if it meant twisting the law to serve his own agenda. Let them try, Andrea replied, her voice cool. The public knows the truth now. They're watching every move he makes. If he wants to risk the backlash, then he can come for me. Shaw paused, her tone softening. Andrea, this is serious. Chase has powerful friends who will back him up. No matter what the evidence says, he'll throw everything at you. Andrea closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of Shaw's words. She knew the risk she was taking. The forces aligned against her. But she also knew that this was what she had fought for her entire career, the chance to expose corruption, to protect the people who had placed their trust in her. Thank you, Shaw, she said, her voice unwavering. Stay on top of this. The truth will speak for itself. After she hung up, Andrea turned to Jackson. It's time to go public with everything. The government investigation, the arrest warrant, every dirty move they've made to bury the truth. We need to make this fight as transparent as possible. Chase can't hide in the shadows anymore. Jackson nodded, already thinking through the next steps. We can release the new documents through Shaw. Get them in front of every major outlet. The people are behind you. Andrea, Chase might control the system, but he doesn't control the public. They spent the next few hours reviewing the files, preparing a press release, and coordinating with Shaw and her team. The safe house was quiet, the air tense, as they worked to outmaneuver the forces arrayed against them. Andrea knew they were playing a dangerous game, but she also knew that transparency was her strongest weapon. If Chase wanted to take her down, He would have to do it in full view of the country. As they finished, Andrea received another text. This one from Morton, her ally within the military. Chase is moving fast. He's got the warrant signed. They're coming for you tonight. Be ready. Andrea looked up, meeting Jackson's gaze. They're coming. He set his jaw, his face grim. Then we're ready. They prepared as best as they could, knowing that any moment could bring the knock at the door. The final showdown between her and the forces of corruption that had plagued the military for years. Andrea took one last look at the files, the evidence she had risked everything to uncover, and felt a surge of pride. This was her legacy, her contribution to a system that desperately needed change. Hours passed in tense silence until finally, as night settled over the city, the unmistakable sound of car engines filled the quiet street outside. Andrea's heart pounded as she looked out the window, catching sight of unmarked vehicles pulling up to the curb. Jackson stood by her side, his hand on her shoulder. Whatever happens next, Andrea, you've already won. Chase may take this fight to the courts, but he can't take back what you've given to the public. Andrea nodded, her eyes filled with a fierce determination. They could take me in, but they can't take away the truth. The heavy knock on the door came, the sound echoing through the safe house. Andrea felt a strange calm settle over her as she moved toward it. Her head held high. She knew this was a risk, that they would try to dismantle her reputation, paint her as a traitor. But she also knew that her fight had sparked a fire that couldn't be put out. She opened the door, her gaze meeting the stern faces of the agents waiting outside. One of them stepped forward, holding up a badge. General Andrea Walker, we have a warrant for your arrest. You're being charged with breach of national security and misconduct. Andrea didn't flinch, her voice steady as she replied, I understand. As they placed her in handcuffs, Andrea felt a surge of pride, a sense of purpose that filled her with strength. She looked back at Jackson and Shaw, their faces filled with quiet support. She was not alone in this fight. As she was led to the waiting car, Andrea caught a glimpse of the flashing cameras. The journalists crowded at the edge of the sidewalk, their cameras capturing every moment. She knew that this was not the end, but the beginning of something much larger than herself. Chase's desperate attempt to silence her would only fuel the demand for change. As the car pulled away, Andrea allowed herself a small, defiant smile. The truth was out there now, too large and too powerful to be contained. She had ignited a movement, a call for accountability. And no matter what Chase did, he could never put out the fire she had started. The reckoning was coming, and Andrea Walker had ensured it would be unstoppable. Andrea Walker sat in the back of the unmarked car, the weight of the handcuffs biting into her wrists. But her mind was as sharp and unyielding as ever. The city lights flashed by in blurs of neon and steel, a stark contrast to the cold resolve that filled her. Despite her surroundings, Andrea knew that this was not a defeat. She had become a symbol, a figurehead for those demanding truth and accountability. And now, as Chase's power play unfolded in real time, she understood just how far he would go to silence her. The car finally stopped outside a high-security facility on the outskirts of the city. Andrea was escorted into a plain, windowless room, its bare walls illuminated by a single, flickering fluorescent light. She sat down at the table, ignoring the agent who was giving her stern orders about protocol. She knew this was all part of the strategy. Intimidate, isolate, break her down before she could fight back. But Andrea Walker was not easily broken. Moments later, the door swung open, and General Martin Chase himself walked in, his expression cold, controlled, yet undeniably triumphant. He took a seat across from her, his eyes assessing, calculating. There was no longer any need for pretense between them. They both knew why she was here. Chase leaned forward, a slight smirk tugging at his lips. Well, General Walker, here we are. Quite a mess you've made. Andrea held his gaze, her voice calm. The only mess here is the one you created. Chase, I just brought it to light. His smirk faded, replaced by a glint of anger. You've cost us millions in defense contracts. You've jeopardized national security. The media is having a field day, and it's your fault. Andrea didn't blink. No, General, It's your fault. You and your allies let greed dictate your decisions. And soldiers paid the price for your negligence. This isn't about me. It's about every life you put at risk to line your pockets. Chase's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, she saw a crack in his carefully composed exterior. He leaned back, his voice cold. Let me be clear, Walker. You're a disgraced officer, a traitor to your country. The public will forget about you soon enough. Once this trial is over, you'll be nothing but a footnote. Andrea's voice didn't waver. The public won't forget. They're demanding answers. And even if I have to go through every legal battle you throw at me, I'll keep fighting. You're the one running out of time. Chase. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension thick, electric. Chase leaned in, his voice a venomous whisper. You think you can win this? Against me? You're just one person. Walker. A woman who couldn't handle the pressure. Andrea's gaze didn't falter. Maybe I'm just one person, but I'm not alone. The public is with me. People are tired of watching soldiers become collateral damage to your ambition. Your power is slipping. Chase. And the more you try to silence me, the more people will see the truth. Chase's eyes flashed, but he forced a calm smile. Leaning back, we'll see about that. General, the system works for those who know how to use it. And you, well, you've always been too idealistic. You forgot how the real world works. With a dismissive wave of his hand, he signaled to the guards at the door. Get her out of my sight. As they led her down the hallway, Andrea felt the sting of his words. But her resolve only hardened. Chase's arrogance was his weakness. He thought he could outlast the truth, that his power could bend the world to his will. But Andrea knew that his time was running out. Her story was already out there, and Chase's every move only added fuel to the fire she had sparked. Later that night, as Andrea sat in a holding cell, she was visited by her lawyer, Claire Mason, a tenacious woman with a sharp intellect and an unwavering sense of justice. Claire's eyes were fierce as she entered, her expression a mixture of determination and admiration. Andrea. Claire greeted, sitting across from her. You're holding up well. Andrea nodded, her voice steady. They could try to intimidate me, but I'm not backing down. How's it looking out there? Claire's eyes gleamed with resolve. Chase's camp is doubling down on their attacks, but they're losing ground. Public sentiment is shifting fast. Veterans, families of soldiers, even former defense officials are speaking out. They're standing with you. Andrea felt a surge of hope. Good, then it's working. Chase thought he could bury this, but he underestimated people's capacity for truth. Claire's expression softened. You're a hero to them. Andrea, people are calling you a patriot, a warrior. Chase may control the system, but he doesn't control public opinion, and we're going to use that to our advantage. They spent the next few hours going over the legal strategy, preparing for the upcoming trial, where Andrea would face charges of endangering national security. Claire laid out their approach, her voice steady, her confidence contagious. Andrea felt a renewed strength, a sense of purpose that reminded her of why she had started this battle in the first place. The following morning, Andrea was transported to a courthouse under heavy security, cameras flashing as she stepped out of the vehicle, handcuffed but unbowed. Journalists shouted questions, civilians chanted her name, and signs reading "Justice for Walker" and "Hold Chase Accountable" lined the streets. Inside the courthouse, the tension was palpable. Andrea sat with Claire by her side, watching as General Chase and his team entered, their expressions hard and resolute. Chase's allies had lined up an army of lawyers, all prepared to paint her as a reckless officer who had endangered her country. But Andrea knew the truth was more powerful than any narrative they could spin. The trial began, with the prosecution laying out their accusations in precise, legalistic terms, claiming that Andrea had recklessly disseminated classified information and jeopardized military operations. They attempted to portray her as unstable, a rogue general driven by ambition rather than integrity. But when it was Claire's turn to speak, she dismantled their arguments with calm, calculated precision. Piece by piece, she revealed the mountain of evidence Andrea had uncovered. The faulty equipment, the cover-ups, The lives lost because of Chase's greed. As the days of the trial went on, more witnesses came forward, soldiers who had served under Andrea, families of those who had been affected by faulty equipment, and even former officials who had seen firsthand the corruption Andrea had fought to expose. One of the most powerful moments came when a former military contractor, a man who had worked for Armatech for over a decade, took the stand. His testimony was damning, describing in detail how safety protocols had been ignored, how Chase had shielded the company from scrutiny, how profits had always taken precedence over lives. The courtroom was silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Andrea watched Chase, seeing the fury in his eyes, the realization that his grip on power was slipping. On the final day of the trial, Andrea took the stand herself. She looked out at the courtroom, filled with journalists, supporters, and families who had come to see her stand for justice. She spoke from the heart, her voice unwavering. "I took an oath to protect this country, to serve with honor. When I saw that my own brothers and sisters in uniform were being put in harm's way for the sake of profits, I knew I had to act. This isn't about ambition or vengeance. This is about integrity, about honoring the lives of those who trusted us." Her words echoed through the courtroom, leaving a powerful silence in their wake. Chase's team tried to counter, but they knew they were losing ground. Andrea had the truth on her side, and the people could feel it. When the verdict was finally delivered, Andrea sat in tense silence, her gaze steady as the judge read the decision. After reviewing all evidence presented, this court finds that General Andrea Walker acted in accordance with her duty, her actions rooted in a commitment to the safety of American soldiers. All charges are hereby dismissed. A wave of relief washed over Andrea as the courtroom erupted. Chase's face twisted in fury, his power crumbling in real time. The press surged forward, capturing the moment that Andrea Walker, against all odds, had triumphed over one of the most entrenched powers in the country. As she stepped out of the courthouse, free and vindicated, Andrea was greeted by a crowd of supporters, their cheers filling the air. She felt the weight of the journey behind her, but also a sense of profound fulfillment. She had fought, she had sacrificed, and she had won, not just for herself, but for every life she had vowed to protect. Andrea looked out at the crowd, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had lit a fire that would continue to burn, a movement for justice that would not be extinguished. And as she walked down the courthouse steps, surrounded by people who believed in her cause, Andrea knew she had truly made a difference. The reckoning had come, and she had won. Andrea Walker sat on a quiet park bench in the heart of Washington, D.C., feeling the crisp morning air brush against her skin. The city hummed with the sounds of daily life, cars whizzing by, people talking, children laughing. It was a strange sensation, being in the open again, free from the shadows where she'd fought a long, silent war against corruption. The battle had left its mark, but she was at peace. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of calm. Her victory over General Chase and the military-industrial complex had ignited a national movement, and the shockwaves were still rippling through the country. People were demanding greater accountability, and the stories she'd uncovered had inspired more whistleblowers to come forward. Her face was still plastered across newsstands, on the covers of magazines, and in headlines that called her everything from the General of Truth to America's reluctant hero. A soft sound of footsteps brought her back to the present. She looked up to see Colonel Daniel Jackson walking toward her, his expression warm but serious. He took a seat next to her, offering her a smile that carried both admiration and relief. "Thought I'd find you here," he said, nodding toward the monument in the distance. "Been a while since we could sit without worrying about someone lurking in the shadows." Andrea returned the smile, a warmth in her eyes that she hadn't felt in a long time. "Feels strange, doesn't it? After everything, to just breathe." Jackson nodded. "You've earned it. What you did, no one else could have done that. You took on an entire system and came out on top. People aren't going to forget that." Andrea looked away, her gaze fixed on a group of children playing nearby. "I didn't do it alone," she said quietly. "Without people like you, and Claire, and Shaw, it wouldn't have been possible." Jackson's smile softened, True, but it was your courage that held us together. And now the whole country knows what's been happening in the shadows. The reforms are already beginning, and you've paved the way for others to keep the pressure on. Andrea took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her journey, the sacrifices she'd made, but also the satisfaction of knowing it had been worth it. I just hope the next generation doesn't have to go through what we did, she said, her voice steady but full of hope. They deserve a military they can trust, an institution that values lives over profits. Jackson placed a hand on her shoulder. Because of you, they just might have that. As they sat in companionable silence, Andrea's phone buzzed with a notification. She glanced down, seeing a message from Shaw. Breaking news. Chase resigns amid pressure from public and Pentagon investigations. More officials implicated in defense contract scandal. Andrea felt a rush of emotions, a mixture of vindication, relief, and something that felt almost like closure. She looked over at Jackson, who had caught a glimpse of the headline. He chuckled softly. It's finally happening. Chase is done. Andrea nodded, letting the words sink in. She had won. But this victory wasn't just hers. It belonged to every soldier who had ever risked their life trusting that their country would protect them. It belonged to the families who had lost loved ones, to the whistleblowers who had come forward, and to the people who had refused to look away. She turned to Jackson, a new determination in her eyes. This isn't the end. You know, there's still more work to be done. We need to make sure these changes stick, that people like Chase don't just slink back into power when the headlines fade. Jackson nodded, his expression serious. I know, and you can count on me to be there, every step of the way. They shared a quiet smile, the kind born from shared hardships and victories. Andrea knew she could trust him, that he would continue to be her ally in this fight for accountability. As the sun rose higher, Andrea felt a shift within herself, a realization that she was no longer just a soldier or a whistleblower. She had become something larger, a voice for those who could not speak up, a leader in the pursuit of integrity. The fight might never truly end, but she was ready for whatever came next. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was an invitation from a veterans advocacy group. They wanted her to speak at an upcoming event, to share her story, to inspire others. Andrea looked down at the message, her heart swelling with both pride and a sense of responsibility. She had been given a platform, a chance to continue making a difference. And while she had never sought the spotlight, she understood that her story was now a beacon for others. She had the opportunity to influence real change, to ensure that her sacrifices and those of countless others were not in vain. Andrea stood, her gaze sweeping across the city she had fought to protect. This place, with its towering monuments and bustling streets, had been the center of her battle. But now, it was a new beginning. Jackson rose with her, sensing her resolve. What's next for General Walker? She smiled, feeling the strength and clarity of her purpose crystallize. I don't know exactly, but I'm going to keep fighting. For justice, for accountability, for the people who still need a voice. As they walked away from the park bench, Andrea felt a surge of energy, a readiness to face whatever came next. She was no longer in the line of fire, but her journey was far from over. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with new battles and hard-won progress. But Andrea Walker was ready to lead, to inspire, and to continue her fight for a world where integrity mattered, where the powerful were held accountable, and where those who served could do so with honor. And as she looked toward the future, Andrea felt a profound sense of hope, a hope that, at last, a new dawn had arrived. Months had passed since Andrea Walker's victory in the courtroom, yet the ripples of her actions continued to spread. What had started as one woman's stand against corruption had become a nationwide reckoning, challenging the very foundations of the military-industrial complex. Andrea had hoped to shed light on the system's flaws. Instead, she had sparked a movement. She stood on a stage at the National Veterans Advocacy Conference, looking out at an audience of soldiers, veterans, families, and civilians whose lives had been touched by her story. She'd been invited as the keynote speaker, an honor she'd accepted with both humility and a fierce sense of responsibility. The room fell silent as Andrea began to speak, her voice steady and strong. "I once thought that my duty was simply to serve my country," she began, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "But service isn't just about following orders. It's about standing up for what is right, even when it's difficult, even when it means challenging those in power." She paused, feeling the weight of her words. "I took an oath to protect the lives of those who serve, to ensure their safety. And when I realized that those in power were putting profit above lives, I knew I had to act, no matter the cost." Her story had become legendary. Media outlets called it the General's War, a phrase that captured the fierceness of her struggle. But for Andrea, it was always about something deeper: her commitment to the truth, her promise to protect the men and women who trusted the system. In the weeks following the trial, a wave of reforms had swept through the defense sector. Contracts were scrutinized more carefully. Transparency increased, and oversight committees had been established to prevent similar abuses. Chase's empire, once considered unbreakable, had fractured, and other figures in power were being forced to confront their complicity. But the changes didn't end in Washington. Across the country, citizens demanded more accountability from all sectors, from corporate boards to local governments. Andrea's fight had inspired others to speak up, to shine a light on hidden injustices, to become the change they wanted to see. As she finished her speech, Andrea felt a sense of profound fulfillment. She had not only defended her own legacy, but had helped build a new standard of integrity for the military and beyond. When she stepped down from the stage, applause filled the air, and she felt the support of every person in the room, a community united by her vision. After the event, she found a quiet moment alone, looking out at the Washington skyline, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. She thought of all those who had helped her along the way: Jackson, Claire, Shaw, and countless others who had sacrificed for the truth. She felt gratitude, a deep sense of honor, and most of all, a peace she hadn't known in years. A voice broke the silence. She turned to see Jackson standing nearby, a familiar look of respect in his eyes. "You did it, Andrea," he said softly, stepping forward. "You've changed the course of history." She gave him a small smile, her gaze warm. "I just did what I had to do. The people, their strength kept me going. They're the ones who made this possible." He nodded, understanding. "What's next?" Andrea took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the question. She no longer needed to fight from the shadows. Her legacy was secured, her battle won. And yet, she knew her work wasn't done. "I want to help build something better," she replied, a glint of determination in her eyes. "To make sure that those who come after us have a system they can believe in, to ensure this fight was worth it." Jackson nodded, a hint of pride in his gaze. "Then let's get to work." And as Andrea Walker turned toward the future, she felt an unshakable sense of purpose. She had weathered the storm, but more than that, she had transformed it into a beacon of hope, a call to action for all who valued truth and justice. The road ahead would be long, filled with challenges and resistance. But she was ready, knowing she was not alone. Together, they would honor the lives of those who had been betrayed, build a legacy of accountability, and safeguard the principles that made their country strong. For Andrea, this was more than a victory. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a chance to shape the future with courage, integrity, and unwavering resolve. And as she looked toward the horizon, she knew her fight would echo for generations to come. A legacy of truth, a promise kept, and a future redefined.